Since the time when the Aboriginal peoples gave this site the name Toronto, a gathering place, this city has been built by immigrants and their descendants. The waves of newcomers changed from decade to decade, until after the Second World War, when black workers and community activists began breaking the barriers created by Canadian government policies. Bromley Armstrong, a UAW member, remembers a pivotal train ride.
With the help of the CLC and the Trades and Labor Congress, we were able to go to Ottawa in 1954, April 27th. A delegation of 35 people went to visit. We went to see the Prime Minister, who refused to see us, but he sent the Minister of Immigration, who was Walter Harris, to see us. The Toronto District Labour Committee on Human Rights, they wrote the brief that we presented to Ottawa.
With changes in immigration policy, Toronto in the 1970s was a city in transition. It was the preferred destination for thousands of immigrants of color who chose to make Canada their home.
Caribana, it was this big project for our Caribbean community. It was a way of saying, thank you, Canada. And we were able to stage the first Caribana in 1967. And everybody liked it. The only problem is it costs money, but nobody has given us money. So nobody paid for it, but they enjoyed it.
What I find when I start going out there looking for work, some of the things that make it quite clear that people of color was being discriminated against. I'll go on a job and ask for a job as a carpenter, and I'll be told, well, listen, we haven't got any carpenter's work, but if you want laborer's work, you're welcome. For carpenters coming from the West Indies, we found that very, very demeaning because, we consider ourselves quality trade people. And I don't think that was specifically to myself. The general feelings of carpenters of color was that we're being discriminated against, even within the union.
Workers of color soon found themselves carrying on another tradition of those who came before them. To better their lives, workers needed unions, and union agreements didn't come without struggle. A series of hard-fought strikes by largely immigrant workers woke many people up to the realities of continuing discrimination, and the problems posed by systemic racism brought community and labor activists together. In trying to build power in their workplaces, new Canadians had to overcome barriers. Lack of English language skills was a major impediment to many members, and so unions had to provide a new form of education.
I was working at the University Settlement House as a community worker in '75. A group of Chinese workers came to see me and said, they would like to put some English classes. Can Settlement House help them? It was quite an humbling and an exciting time. And together we created a whole new curriculum. We could really inject some relevant workplace content. We could integrate the sense of trade unionism and encouraging them to participate in their union.
Mama Mouse was babysitting Baby Mouse one day, and a cat came into the room and went up to Mama Mouse, and Mama Mouse said, "Woo, woo, woo," and the cat freaked out and went into a corner. And Baby Mouse, watching Mama Mouse with wonder, looked very puzzled. And Mama Mouse said, "It is always best to have a second language."
At the height of the ESL and literacy programs running with the Labour Council of Toronto, the Hamilton Labour Council, and the Ontario Federation of Labour, there were probably 100 programs going, more probably. The Labour Council itself had 25 programs in 25 workplaces.
It was such a symbolic, but it's also a very significant turning point for participations of immigrant workers in the labor movement.
The early 80s, in Toronto, we saw a whole resurgence of the hate groups, such as the KKK. And that coupled with some of the police shooting in 79, 80 with Albert Johnson, Wade Lawson, the community just felt, particularly workers of color communities just felt we were under siege. And with the presence of Ku Klux Klan, it actually mobilized the communities, the broader community together and say, no, we can't, we have to stop this.
If you look back in the 80s, when the Sikh issues came, such as the turban and the kirpan, they were facing enormous problems across the country. And they were attacked physically, it was not uncommon. So they basically started creating some kind of what we call a fight back. They were dealing with either the policies such as immigration issues or the issues, the direct violence.
I think the labor movement also start taking notice that it's an issue they could not afford not to address.
But it wasn't language alone that stood between workers and their rights to equality. Racial discrimination was systemic, and tackling it was no easy task.
He said each white man should own a nigger, and when he came to harass me, he talked openly. He wanted to teach that Chinese son of a bitch Wei Fu a lesson.
Wei Fu was subject to verbal and written racial harassment. His case was first taken up by the Chinese community, and then his union and the labor movement.
A number of significant cases. The black nurses from Northwestern Hospital, John Prasad, to me are quite significant. And it speaks to a different strategy that's being forged.
As our movement became stronger, it started to look at every aspect of discrimination. Labor learned to link the struggle for global solidarity with the fight against racism at home.
There were some tremendous people who sacrificed a lot of their parts of their lives to work on behalf of the movement in South Africa. And when Mandela came to Canada, he recognized the role that Canada had played, certainly not the leaders, but the people of Canada.
The work of developing equity involved demanding that governments at all levels adopt real measures to tackle systemic racism. Pat Case was a union printer who was elected as a school trustee and went on to lead its equity and access work.
Back in the early 80s, the Board of Education started a number of residential anti-racism camps. Through the camp process, students were exposed to an incredible variety of issues related to race and anti-racism. The transformation in young people's minds that you saw happen right in front of you, it was absolutely magical.
Well, the Racism Hurts Everyone campaign, it entailed, we had a series of fact sheets in different languages. We had a media campaign, slots on the radio, slots on the television. At the time, there was no other federation, no other labor organization in Canada that was doing that kind of work. And I think we were successful in having our affiliates establish human rights committees, human rights conferences followed. Many affiliates have developed their own educational materials.
These CAW brothers on the picket line are fighting racial harassment. But in their case, the harasser is their employer at Unicel in Toronto. Most of the workers at this plant are Vietnamese immigrants.
In recent years, the Ontario Federation of Labor has made fighting racial harassment a top priority. This workshop on racism is one of many programs they run.
And I can recall going across this province doing this anti-racist work. We were going across the province to labor councils, encouraging them to establish human rights committees. And there was a lot of resistance. Often you heard that we don't have any problems and why you're raising a can of worms and when we don't have any problems. And so from those experiences, I gathered that it must have been very difficult for workers of colors to participate fully in their unions.
As workers of color became a larger segment of the workforce, it was natural that within workplaces, new leaders would emerge. Another kind of challenge would have to be met. Herman Stewart was a union representative serving a diverse membership in the garment industry.
I was told by the outgoing president of the region that They don't believe that the time was right for me to seek the office of president.
Running for top position may have tested the union structure, but the members elected Herman. Across the labor movement, workers of color were posing questions about how the top positions failed to reflect the changing workforce. The solution was to organize.
A seat was established for a person of color, and Herman Stewart was the first person of color on the OFL executive board.
What we set out to do is to pressure the CLC. We made the breakthrough at the OFL. So we decided that the next target is the CLC. We want to see minority representation at the CLC level. And the powers that be at the time said, we got the message and something will happen.
By the next CLC convention, they offered us one seat. CBTU, again, Coalition of Black Trade Unions, made a button, 1 + 1 = 2. And by the end of the convention, we had 2 seats. So those are important steps, I think, that we need to acknowledge.
The most important part was our respective union had become that much different organization than they were 20 or 50 years ago. Now recognizing that other voices can speak in those institutions on behalf of those unions that didn't necessarily have to be white, they could be people of color, and most importantly, we had all the skills that was necessary. Now the opportunity was there, and those unions created the space for us to be successful at those positions. The convention essentially mandated the Congress to create a task force, and if you look at the depth of the task force, it dealt with just about every social, political issue in the society and provided some recommendations how unions can go about trying to now effect political change. And I think it provided a real solid foundation for the work that Congress eventually took on in a much broader way, creating a separate department, and of course starting to look at all its programs and its way of how it presented a face of the Canadian labor movement.
I think the goal become much more crystallized too. On the community front and encouraging our labor movement to get involved, it's through the whole employment equities campaign. And I think we were all consumed by the whole employment equity campaign and the alliance and the coalition building, and recognizing a lot of the patterns of systemic discriminations are the same. It impacts us differently, but ultimately where we want to go, it's shared.
With a government that would listen, equity issues started to be addressed. But in 1995, we suffered a major defeat.
The first thing that the Harris government did was repeal employment equity legislations. They eliminated the anti-racism secretariat, and they dismantle and disintegrate Ontario welcome houses.
So when Mike Harris and his gang of thugs came into power, what they did was they smacked everybody. Labor communities, social justice organizations, anti-poverty groups. So what that did was everybody went around saying, what can I do?
We are on strike today because exactly 1 year ago, this government killed the NDP labor law that bans scabbing in Ontario. Scabs have been forced off the welfare rolls by the cutbacks of scabs in our plant. It is a shame!
The common sense revolution of Mike Harris rolled back many of our gains. We lost ground, but the foundation was still in place. The sense of pride in our achievements and the new leaders in our movement continued the struggle.
Color in the Union is about researching racial minorities' involvement in QP. And we made up cards, poster-sized cards, and it's an exhibition now in waiting to become a book.
I would certainly want our next generation to be aware of the role played by our ancestors, our forefathers that came before us, the kind of discrimination that they faced, and the struggle and the toils and the difficulties that they had. In the early 1980s, when Canadian Pacific Railroad was celebrating its 100th anniversary, and they took out full-page ads and said that we're the railroad that will lay tracks from sea to sea and built a nation. But then those of us in the Chinese community look and say, well, just a minute here. What about the 17,000 Chinese railroad workers that laid the tracks? Thousands of them are buried in the mountains of BC, some in unmarked graves. Some of them probably have blown to bits when they were handling explosives.
We shall not give up the fight. We have only started. We have only started. We have only started. We shall not give up the fight. We have only started.
One of the suggestions to get maybe a choir to come in. After they decided, why not get workers to perform? Different workers from different hotels was coming in then. So that's how we started up.
To build a labor movement, we need to build a relationship with the communities. To build a relationship with the community, we have to find the way how we can connect together. I think culture is the main thing. How we can integrate it between each other.
Organizing ourselves is towards our own benefit and to bring a better, economic situation to ourselves and to our family, to benefits, healthcare, and those kind of issues. It should be through a union.
While the unions of our city are pursuing active equity policies and campaigns, many challenges remain.
So we're still struggling in terms of systemic discrimination. I think what we've seen, particularly since 9/11, is continued targeting of particular racial groups. And you've seen that happen with SARS, with the war in Iraq, with what's happening in Afghanistan. And you find here, and it's not just about police racially profiling people, it's about all systems, all government systems. And so that's why it's important to have the voices of those people heard within the union movement, within the workplace, within society, to make the changes that are necessary.
As more workers of color took on a more central or leadership role within the local, that the way we looked at grievances was a lot different.
In my own union, we created a 2-week program called Workers of Color Leadership Program, specifically geared to address the challenges that workers of color would face if they decide to take on that responsibility. There are many who have made it without the training, but a lot more became successful because they had the opportunity to get that training.
Our next challenge in the future, how do we bring on more women of color to different capacities throughout the labor movement?
I was mentored actually by two white brothers, who met me and said, this person is really keen and interested to want to get involved, has skills that can offer, and they showed me the ropes and the structure of OPSEU and how things get done.
In my case, it was the previous president, Michael Phillips. He took me under his wing and he taught me how not to kick the door in, how to just open it a crack and push in. I in turn made sure that I brought somebody along with me.
I actually did an internship with HERE this past summer, doing the groundwork for an organizing drive. And right now I have something called a lead organizer. I don't know if other unions have the same terms, but basically it's an organizer, who's seasoned, and I am, shadowing that individual.
We have to go into the workplace and basically recruit young people and do some outreach with them. Let them know that there is a place for them in our union.
So
a lot of people are always complaining about the union movement being out of sync, and just the fact of doing this event, getting out to the urban kids and all that, it's been really, really fun.
George, yeah.
Workshop on pirate radio, and also a workshop on organizing young people and organizing your workplaces. Learn about your rights, and let's party today.
That was an event that maybe 10 years ago, labor movement would never dream of doing, inviting young workers of color to do breakdancing and rap, but all with a message of worker solidarity.
A long history of linking the struggles of workers and communities has been the basis of our anti-racist and equity agenda. We have a legacy that we must not forget. And as we celebrate the diversity of our city and the power of working people to shape their own future, this story will continue.
The fundamental value of this movement is equality. And difficult as that may be to achieve, that we stand clearly on the side of fighting for social justice for all citizens, not just the ones who belong to a movement.
How do we create opportunities and moments, such as the Labour Council's Workers of Colour Conference?
The labor movement is the one social movement in society that can make change to the benefit of all workers.
You see Labour Council has more workers of color in leadership positions, more workers of color participating as a whole, and through that has been able to make the links with community organizations because it's a vital part of building a progressive Toronto.
Let us make this word, brother or sister, be a reality. Let's work as brothers and sisters together to build a strong trade union movement.